It's Friday the 8th of September and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by our correspondent Jenny Davidson in Edinburgh and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Sean Curran. On the programme this week, as schools affected by crumbling concrete struggle to stay open, the government defends its handling of the crisis.
Because children's safety is our absolute priority and it was right to make the difficult decision to change our guidance for education settings so that areas previously deemed to contain non-critical RAC are now being closed.
13 years into a Conservative government and the public realm is literally crumbling around the next generation.
The blame game continued at this week's Prime Minister's questions.
The truth is, this crisis is the inevitable result of 13 years of cutting corners, botched jobs, sticking plaster politics.
We have acted decisively to ensure the safety of children and minimise disruption to education, as we have laid out and communicated extensively. That is the right thing to do.
MPs clash over whether a loosening of house building rules could lead to river pollution.
Here we have it. Proposals to unpick the Habitats Directive and disapply the nutrient neutrality rules which protect our precious rivers and sensitive ecosystems.
It is important to consider what we are talking about here, which is unblocking 100,000 homes which add very, very little in terms of pollution.
And Scotland's First Minister puts childcare at the centre of his plan for the year ahead. Well, it's certainly been a busy week as MPs return to Westminster after the summer recess. Let's chat it through now with Sean. Sean, hello, welcome back. So,
always a pleasure to be back.
It's lovely to have you here. Let's talk about that topic that's really dominated the conversation this week, this idea of crumbly concrete affecting schools. Tell us what's been going on.
Yeah, there's probably never a good time to tell a school that it might have to close some of its buildings, but certainly on the eve of the new school term, the new academic year in England, probably the very worst moment. But that's the situation the government, the Department for Education, found itself in because of these concerns about this concrete known as RAC. It's a type of lightweight concrete that was used between the 1950s and the 1990s in a lot of public buildings, not just schools. But the focus, as you say, as MPs returned to Westminster, was on the plight of these schools in England. More than 100 had been told they'd have to close part of their buildings. And there were questions for ministers. We heard the Prime Minister at the start of the week saying it was completely and utterly wrong to say that when he was the Chancellor, he had somehow cut the funding for the repairs for schools. And we had the Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan, at the end of a TV interview having, well, a bit of a sweary outburst, I think we can say, because she was expressing her frustration at the way the media had covered all of this. But as MPs gathered back in the Commons for the start of, I suppose, what you might call the new political term, the Education Secretary found herself at the dispatch box for more than an hour and a half explaining what she had been doing.
Such was the level of our concern, however, that I asked officials to seek evidence of risks, including to non-critical RAC. It's because of this proactive approach that we discovered details of 3 new cases over the summer, where RAC that would have been graded as non-critical had failed without warning. The first of these was in a commercial setting. The second was in a school in a different educational jurisdiction, and in this instance, the plank that failed remained suspended, resting on a steel beam. As the plank was fully intact, the DFE engineers were able to investigate the situation. In their professional judgment, the panel affected would have been previously rated as non-critical, but it had failed. Ministerial colleagues and I were already extremely concerned. Then a third failure of RAC panels occurred at a school in England in late August. This was a panel that had been previously graded as non-critical. Because children's safety is our absolute priority and it was right to make the difficult decision to change our guidance for education settings so that areas previously deemed to contain non-critical RAC are now being closed.
What an utter shambles. The defining image of 13 years of Conservative government. Children cowering under steel props to stop the ceiling falling in on their heads. 13 years into a Conservative government, and the public realm is literally crumbling around the next generation. The Education Secretary said this morning that, in her view, it is not the job of her department to ensure the safety of our children's schools, that she was doing a good job. Schools are literally at risk of collapse. She is the Education Secretary. Whose responsibility does she think it is then?
Well, thank the Honourable Lady, and of course that is me. What matters is what you do. When I was given new information and had to consider the impacts that this would have on our schools and children, I took action, even though it was politically difficult. Yesterday, when the Honourable Lady was asked about Wales and RAC, she waved away concerns and said there was no problem. Why? Because it's a Labour government with Labour policies.
Given that the existing budgets are already extremely stretched, what discussions is she having with Treasury colleagues to access additional funding?
Every year we get capital budgets and we are investing significantly in our schools. Overall, the capital budget in the 2021 spending review is £19 billion, of which £7 billion is allocated to 23-24.
May I, through the Secretary of State, thank Baroness Barron, who reached out immediately to me, together with a highly competent senior official, when this problem arose in one of my schools this March. I have rarely, in 26 years in this House, seen a department so proactive on an issue as they were on this one, and I thank them for it.
If the Minister's really short of cash in her department, perhaps one option might be to bring in a swear box to raise a few bucks.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her joke, but as a Scouser I have a bit of a higher bar, I think.
It is right that children's safety comes first, but it is also right that we're mindful of the language that we use towards children and don't make them more frightened than they need to be. And I would encourage colleagues not to over-exaggerate or generalise these risks, but to work with each affected school calmly to get this resolved for children.
Madam Deputy Speaker, children in Somerset have gone back to school and are going back to school this week in buildings which may collapse at any moment. At least 3 schools in Somerset and Frome may have this week concrete. Will the Education Secretary apologise for all the stress that this government has caused families because they have slashed repair bills and sat on their hands for months?
The Secretary of State made clear earlier today that she does not consider this situation to be her fault or her responsibility. So maybe she can tell us who she thinks has been sat on their asses.
Well, I think, as I made the point to the journalist earlier, I made an off-the-cuff remark at the end of an interview which was already finished. But in terms of what I was responding to, effectively the journalist had given me an interview which made everything my fault.
Well, that was the Education Secretary there. But of course, this dominated the first Prime Minister's questions of the term as well.
Yes, no real prizes for guessing what Sir Keir Starmer would focus on in this first really exchange with Rishi Sunak for months. The last time they'd met in the Commons was back in July. And of course, because this is one of those issues which is still developing and there are still questions about it, it wasn't over by the time the two leaders met on Wednesday.
The roof of Singlewell Primary School in Gravesend collapsed in May 2018. Thankfully, it happened at the weekend and no children were injured. The concrete ceiling was deemed dangerous and liable to collapse, and everyone knew the problem existed in other schools. Yet the Prime Minister decided to halve the budget for school maintenance just a couple of years later. Does he agree with his Education Secretary that he should be thanked for doing a good job?
Mr. Speaker, I know how concerned parents, children and teachers are, and I want to start by assuring them that the government is doing everything it can to fix this quickly and minimise the disruption to children's education. We make no apology for acting decisively in the face of new information. And let me provide the House with an update on where we are. Of the 22,000 schools in England, the vast majority won't be affected. In fact, in 2/3 of inspections of suspected schools, RAC is not actually present. And to tackle the 1% of schools that have been affected so far, the 1%, we are assigning each of those schools a dedicated caseworker and providing extra funding to fix the problem.
The truth is, this crisis is the inevitable result of 13 years of cutting corners, botched jobs, sticking plaster politics. It's the sort of thing you expect from cowboy builders, saying that everyone else is wrong, everyone else is to blame, protesting they've done an effing good job, even as the ceiling falls in. The difference, Mr. Speaker, is that in this case, the cowboys are running the country. Isn't he ashamed that after 13 years of Tory government, children are cowering under steel supports, stopping their classroom roof, falling in?
This is exactly the kind of political opportunism that we've come to expect from Captain Hindsight over here. Before today, he's never once raised this issue with me across this dispatch box.
If you can believe it, in April this year, the Education Secretary signed a contract for refurbishment of her offices. It's got a personal stamp of approval on it. It cost, I can't quite believe this, £34 million. Can he explain to parents whose children aren't at school this week why he thinks a blank cheque for his Tory minister's office is better use of taxpayers' money than stopping schools collapsing?
Well, Mr. Speaker, what I'd say to parents is, in the receipt of new information, we have acted decisively to ensure the safety of children and minimise disruption to education, as we have laid out and communicated extensively. That is the right thing to do. And I would also gently point out to him, Mr. Speaker, whilst the Department for Education started this process 18 months ago in spring of last year, as far as I can tell, in Labour-run Wales, they still don't know which schools are affected, Mr. Speaker. But again, he brought up this issue of funding, Mr. Speaker. And again, let's look back to what happened in that spending review. Because in that spending review, I increased the Department for Education's capital budget by 25% to a record £7 billion, Mr. Speaker. It tripled the amount that we spend on children with special education needs and disabilities. It improved the condition of the overlooked FE estate, and it set the course for per-pupil funding to be the highest ever.
Mr. Speaker, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the Prime Minister thinks everything is all right. But let's look at his proposals for the winter when it comes to a cost of living package. Because when it comes to energy bills, his plan, of course, is to do nothing. When it comes to mortgage bills, his plan is to do nothing. And when it comes to food bills, his plan is to do nothing. So when the when the Secretary of State for Education said earlier this week that everyone was doing nothing, she was referring to the Prime Minister, wasn't she?
Mr. Speaker, I think is a little bit out of practice, because when it comes to energy bills, what we have done is pay for around half of a typical family's energy bill over the past year. Support worth £1,500, Mr. Speaker, benefiting families in Scotland. He asks about mortgages, Mr. Speaker. The Chancellor's Mortgage Charter covers 90% of the mortgage market and ensures that a typical mortgage holder can save hundreds of pounds a month when it comes to their mortgage refinancing. And when he talked about energy, thanks to the actions of this government, we are supporting the hundreds of thousands of jobs in the Scottish oil and gas industry, securing this country's energy supply, something that he opposes. I will always do what's right for the people of Scotland, Mr. Speaker, and it's time the SNP did the same.
Well, that was Prime Minister's questions there, or parts of it at least. In other news, we've heard that an inquiry will be set up into how the NHS handled the case of Lucy Letby, of course, the former neonatal nurse who was sentenced to life for the murder of 7 babies and the attempted murder of 6 others. And this week, MPs were told who will lead that inquiry.
Yes, the Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, came to the Commons to make a statement. Now, in the immediate aftermath of Letby's conviction, the government announced that there would be an independent inquiry, but it very soon faced criticism from various people, including the families of some of those children who were killed, because they were concerned that this inquiry would not have the power to force people to come and give evidence and be able to get all of the evidence it needed. And so ministers pretty quickly performed a U-turn and said, yes, that they would give the inquiry these extra powers. And when Steve Barclay appeared before MPs, he confirmed that a senior judge, Lady Justice Thirlwell, will now head this inquiry.
Losing a child is the greatest sorrow any parent can experience. I'm sure the victims' families have been in the thoughts and prayers of members across the House, as they have been in mine. We have a duty to get them the answers they deserve, to hold people to account, and to make sure lessons are learned.
What we do know is her victims should be starting a new term of school today. Our thoughts are with the families who have suffered the worst of traumas, whose pain and suffering we couldn't possibly imagine, who will never forget the children cruelly taken from them. No stone can be left unturned in the search for the lessons that must be learned, but it is already clear that there were deep issues with the culture and leadership of the Countess of Chester Hospital. And this is not the first time that whistleblowers working in the NHS have been ignored when listening to their warnings could have saved lives.
Given the scope of Cheshire Police's Operation Hummingbird has now broadened, what reassurance can the Secretary of State offer my community about our hospital?
It is important that we both reassure patients that are using the Countess of Chester now in terms of the measures that have been put in place, and that's why I wanted, particularly in my statement, to bring to the House's attention the steps that have already been taken. Obviously, with NHS England colleagues, we are working closely with the Countess of Chester in terms of next steps, but it is important that the measures we've taken provide reassurance in terms of the quality of care that is available at Chester now.
Despite the freedom to speak up at measures that have been instituted across the country, I still see in trusts in the North West whistleblowers in other departments marginalised, bullied, unfairly treated, having their careers trashed, all because it would appear there is a culture of defending the reputation of institutions rather than protecting the safety of patients.
I urge him, as he seeks answers to how it can be prevented, to focus on three things: how he can develop clear lines of medical, nursing and managerial accountability, how he can prevent poor managers from moving from trust to evade such accountability, and how, if 7 consultants find themselves in a similar position in the future, they can escalate beyond their trust, outside their trust, to get some attention.
Why is he waiting for another review or for the inquiry before finally closing this revolving door and introducing independent regulation for hospital managers in the same way as medical staff are subjected to?
It's right that we get the balance right, because he mentions concerns that certain trusts may be seen as more difficult to manage. And what we don't want to do is create an environment where people are unwilling to go to those more difficult trusts because they fear the risk that they carry.
And MPs also had the opportunity to discuss the serious data breaches which came to light last month and which exposed the personal information about officers serving in the police force of Northern Ireland. What was said in the Commons?
Yes, so this is another big story that happened when Parliament was on its summer break. And what happened this week was that the leader of the DUP, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson, asked an urgent question, basically bringing the Northern Ireland Secretary, Chris Heaton-Harris, to the Commons. Now, Sir Geoffrey welcomed the news that the Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland, Simon Byrne, had resigned. Mr Byrne had been under pressure following a number of controversies, but the leader of the DUP and other MPs had questions for the Minister, and they had questions about the situation facing police officers now in Northern Ireland.
The data breach is deeply concerning and significant. Recent events in Northern Ireland, including the terrible attack on Detective Chief Inspector John Caldwell, show there are still a small minority in Northern Ireland who wish to cause harm to PSNI officers and staff in Northern Ireland. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank all those individuals who work to keep the people of Northern Ireland safe. My many thanks, and we all owe them our gratitude. I recognise too that there is significant concern about the consequences of this data breach. Many PSNI officers and staff have raised concerns about themselves and their family. In response to these concerns, the PSNI and wider security partners are taking appropriate action and are working around the clock to investigate the incident, provide reassurance and mitigate any risk to the safety and security of officers and staff.
For the rank and file members and for the staff who work in our police stations, for their personal details to be released into the public domain and find its way into the hands of dissident Republicans is frankly unforgivable.
Can I urge the Secretary of State, will you do everything possible with the PSNI to make sure this never ever happens again, and to ensure that documents of this sensitivity are subject to sufficient protection to ensure that there's never any mistake of this sort made ever again?
This is a really significant breach. And it has, as one police officer put it to me, when I joined the police service and when I go to work, I used to think that maybe people knew what I did for a living. But now that's completely flipped. And I feel that they absolutely know what I do for a living, and that has changed the psychology around the whole piece. And so, I know there's a lot more assurances that need to be given for us to get to the place that she wishes to get to.
The whole House wants to ensure that the staff get the support, protection and reassurance they need. But to succeed in doing that, we really do need leadership from the government and from the political parties in Northern Ireland to get the Executive and the Assembly up and running again as quickly as possible.
This represented a shocking breach of confidentiality, not just in terms of people's personal data, but it also represents a shocking breach in the confidence that PSNI officers and staff can have in the organisation.
There is a much deeper and more significant problem than just one individual, and it's something we've been warning about for years. It's the real crisis in recruitment and retention of Catholic officers and staff to the PSNI. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that the best way to deal with that crisis is to bring back 50-50 recruitment?
The fact that it remains secret for many people, the job they do, the fact that we are somehow thinking that this is normal for Northern Ireland 25 years after the peace process is unacceptable. This would not be normal in any other part of the UK or in Ireland.
On the issue of the data breach, can I ask the Secretary to assure the House that money will not be any obstacle in the short run in terms of the relocation of any officer? Because there will be people, particularly those from a Catholic nationalist background, those who are operating in intelligence and highly sensitive security roles, who are particularly exposed alongside everyone who's at risk, and that there will be no barriers put in place to ensure their safety, which is of utmost paramount.
I think I have to be quite careful in how I answer this because it is very much related to security matters. But I think I can say that he is correct to assume what he assumes.
That's Chris Heaton-Harris there. Thank you very much for taking us through all of that, Sean. Stay where you are, because we'll come back to you. But let's go now to Edinburgh and our Scotland political reporter, Jenny Davidson, who's at the Scottish Parliament in Holyrood. Jenny, Humza Yousaf set out his first programme for government as First Minister this week. What were some of the key announcements?
Well, that's right. Of course, the Scottish Parliament returned from its summer recess this week. The main focus of the week has been on that programme for government, where the Scottish Government sets out its plans for the year, what bills it will bring forward, and an extra focus on it this year because it was Humza Yousaf's first programme for government as First Minister. People looking to get an idea of what he stands for, what kind of policies he's going to bring forward. He said that it was unashamedly anti-poverty and pro-growth. Some of the key policies included a pay rise for childcare workers and social care workers, going up to a minimum of £12 an hour from next year. The expansion of the free school meals programme to primary 6 and primary 7 pupils, starting with those in receipt of the Scottish Child Payment, speeding up the approvals process for wind farms, and a consultation on the banning of disposable vapes. But the criticism from the opposition was that there wasn't enough new in it and there was too much of a rehash of previous policies.
So I can confirm today we will provide funding
So staff in the private, voluntary and independent sector who deliver funded early learning and childcare are paid a minimum of £12 an hour from April of next year. High quality early education and childcare is a perfect example of a policy that is both anti-poverty and pro-growth. And I'm proud that Scotland has the most generous childcare offer in the UK.
When Scotland needed a national government, we've once again been given a nationalist government. Instead of speaking to Scotland, Humza Yousaf would rather be marching alongside flag-waving independence diehards like he was at the weekend. He would rather be campaigning, as he himself did, the self-titled first activist, than governing as First Minister. And this programme reflects that.
This is an SNP government that has lost its way, that has no clear direction, no sense of purpose and no central mission. And they also can't escape from the fact that they are trying to clear a mess of their own making. 16 years of incompetence and financial mismanagement. Because the truth is, Scotland needed a programme for government to match the scale of the twin crises hitting Scots, a cost of living crisis and an NHS crisis.
There have been questions too about how some of this is going to be funded. Humza Yousaf wouldn't be drawn on that at the moment, but he did say there would be some very difficult decisions come the budget in December.
And meanwhile, Nicola Sturgeon made her first speech since becoming a backbench MSP. What did she have to say?
Well, she looked quite happy about it. She said her perspective had altered, that things looked different and perhaps clearer from the backbenches. Not surprisingly, she praised Humza Yousaf's programme for government and picked up on some of the points that meant most to her. But she concluded her speech by talking about the state of politics in Scotland and the way it's carried out. She said that she accepted her share of responsibility for the state of political discourse, but that made her more determined to play her part in changing it. She said polarisation in politics is much maligned, but she said it was the paralysis that can result from that we should be most worried about.
So perhaps we need to, as we embark on a new term, have some principles in mind to guide us. Firstly, a collective recognition that the challenges we face require tough decisions. These are by definition hard, they're often unpopular, and will always meet resistance from those who benefit from the status quo. That's not an argument to ignore those voices, but it is important that we make sure that they don't become an automatic veto on the change that is necessary. Second, an acceptance that we can't just wish for the ends of our policy objectives. We must also have the means to deliver. That means mature debate on how we pay for our policy priorities, but also on the powers this Parliament has and needs. I want this Parliament to be independent and believe it soon will be. I don't think I'm creating news with that statement. But that will never stop me arguing for incremental change along the way. And likewise, those who oppose independence shouldn't close their minds to new powers that allow us to better tackle the big challenges we face in the here and now. And finally, Presiding Officer, disagreement and robust debate isn't just the essence of democracy. It's part of what makes us human. But the dynamic that it creates is not fixed.
First Minister, you will need to conclude. Sorry, Nicola Sturgeon, you will need to conclude.
And stalemate, or can we use the creative tension to drive improvement for all? I hope that in this term we see more of the latter than the former, and I look forward to playing my part in it.
Thank you, Ms Sturgeon.
Yes, it may take some time for people to get used to Nicola Sturgeon having moved to the back benches, and it must be a big change for her too, obviously, having been Deputy First Minister and then First Minister for the last 16 years.
Certainly. Now, we've been talking a lot here about reinforced autoclaved aerated concrete, or RAC, as most people know it, and that came up at First Minister's questions too, didn't it?
That's right, it actually came up 3 times this week, as well as First Minister's questions. There was also a topical question about it and a government statement on it. Now, some of the key questions have been around perhaps a slightly different approach to this from the Scottish Government. Perhaps fair to say it's been a little calmer. Scottish schools, for example, went back as normal last month, albeit with some pupils being moved into alternative accommodation. But the key questions really have been around what the Scottish Government is doing about it and looking for a definitive list of affected buildings, particularly in schools.
Presiding Officer, the news this week of the risk of reinforced autoclaved aerated concrete known as RAC in our schools is causing understandable anxiety for parents, pupils and staff. The Government have confirmed that 37 schools have been identified as containing RAC. So can I ask when the Government first became aware of the issue and what steps it took? And also, will the Government commit to publishing the list of the schools impacted so parents and pupils have at least some of the answers they deserve?
First Minister.
Can I thank Anas Sauer for his question. So we were informed and about RAC for not just many months, actually, for years. And that's why, for example, we ensured that our education leaders had the appropriate guidance from the Institute of Structural Engineers last year. We have been proactive over that period, particularly the Education Secretary has been proactive in relation to her discussions with local authorities to ensure we have a full understanding of the picture. I can confirm that, given that we have further information back from local authorities, that 40 schools have been identified that have RAC in them, and of course the appropriate mitigations have been put in place. In terms of Anna Sauer's direct question, I think it's a very fair question. Yes, we will work with local authorities to ensure that that information is published. I would expect that publication to happen at the end of the week, not just a list of the schools that have been affected, but I think if we can give more information around the mitigations in place, that will give some confidence to parents and indeed to pupils and staff who are in those schools.
And of course, while much of the focus has been on schools, lots of other buildings, including hospitals, are affected as well. Stirling University had to partially close its Students' Union this week after RAC was found in that. So there's quite an extensive process going on to identify the buildings that are affected before it can be dealt with.
OK, thank you, Jenny. Lots more to come on that, I'm sure. Jenny Davidson reporting there at the Scottish Parliament. Well, let's return to events here in Westminster with our parliamentary correspondent, Sean Curran. And Sean, there were fears expressed this week over proposals to scrap pollution rules so that they could build more homes in England. What did they have to say?
Yes, this was an announcement from the Levelling Up Secretary, Michael Gove. And basically what he wants to do is he wants to change the planning rules to remove some regulations that date back from the time when the UK was part of the European Union. So they were introduced through a European Union directive. And basically they're designed to protect waterways. And what ministers and some developers say is that there could be tens of thousands of new homes built before 2030 if these restrictions are removed. And their argument is that new homes do not cause that much pollution to rivers and waterways, and so the rules should be changed. But there are opponents of the move, both in and outside of Westminster, and the Green Party's Caroline Lucas asked an urgent question to bring a minister to the Commons so that she could argue against this proposed change.
Over the past 8 years, ministers have stood at that dispatch box and promised time and again that leaving the European Union would not lead to a weakening of environmental standards. Those of us who raised our concerns have been repeatedly told that we were scaremongering. As recently as the 12th of June, the Solicitor General said we will not lower environmental protections in relation to the retained EU Law Act. Yet here we have it. Proposals to unpick the Habitats Directive and disapply the nutrient neutrality rules which protect our precious rivers and sensitive ecosystems.
We do not accept, as she stated, that we will weaken our commitment to the environment at all. It is important to consider what we are talking about here, which is unblocking 100,000 homes, which add very, very little in terms of pollution. But our approach, to be very clear, means there will be no overall loss to environmental outcomes.
It is therefore right in our view that the operation of the rules around nutrient neutrality are reviewed with a view to addressing problematic delays and increasing the pace at which homes can be delivered in these areas. However, we have serious concerns about the approach the government have decided upon. Not only does it involve disapplying the conservation of habitats and species regulations, but it does not legally secure the additional funding pledges to deliver nutrient management programmes, and does not provide for a legal mechanism to ensure housing developers contribute towards mitigation.
I'm delighted to hear of his support for our sensible and practical and pragmatic approach that we are taking to unblock much needed housing across the country.
We have an issue whereby 100,000 homes spanning 74 council areas are being blocked. Those are homes which have planning permission already granted, which cannot be built because of this perverse legacy ruling.
It looks like the government making it up as it goes along. Is this actually a panic response by the government to the collapsing numbers of housing starts in this country that the Minister simply wants to do something, anything about?
I think what I would say, and I come back to time and time again, we need to unblock these planning permissions. We know we need housing all over the country. We are doing it at the same time as protecting the environment, and I very much hope to have further dialogue with him about this in the future.
It's always baffling to hear those who believe in environmental improvement saying only the EU way works. Does she agree with me that actually outside the European Union we've been able to adapt our laws to what works for this country, but also make improvements in areas like marine protected areas, like the support we provided to agriculture outside the common agricultural policy? And to say that leaving the European Union has meant a degradation of our approach to the environment is simply nonsense.
The answer was not to scrap it, but to change their guidance and make it more intelligent so that we protect our waterways and our landscapes from pollution while not stopping vital development. Why did the government spend 4 years dithering before panicking, overreacting and then acting in line with own nature by damaging British nature?
If I build a small house or put a little extension on the side of my current house, am I really damaging the watercourses to the same degree as pig farming and chicken farming, and therefore are these laws completely and utterly missing the mark of what they were well-intentioned to do in the first place?
The simple answer to my honourable friend's question is no, he's right. Of course they're not. The existing legal framework that we have been hindered by has had a disproportionate effect on planning permissions and house building when actually the main source of the pollution lies elsewhere. So overall, this package is going to be able to deliver house building and extensions in his constituency, help the small builders and of course protect our rivers.
So there was MPs in the House of Commons, but also the House of Lords was back this week, and peers debated the travel chaos that many people saw when those thousands of flights were cancelled last week because of problems with air traffic control. What was said there?
Yes, this was another one of those big summer stories, and in fact it touches on one of the other stories as well, because we heard this week that the Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan, had difficulties getting back to the UK in order to deal with the concrete issue because she was stuck because of those problems. So when they debated it in the House of Lords, it was quite interesting. One of the issues that came up in the last couple of weeks was the plight of passengers and how they might be compensated or helped. And so what we had was a former Transport Secretary proposing that the law should be changed so that those passengers could get some compensation if it was to happen again.
The Government deeply regrets the recent NATS operational failure and its impact on airlines and their customers. This incident is being investigated and lessons will be learned. NATS has an outstanding aviation safety record and is regulated against service targets which are set by the Civil Aviation Authority. There are incentives for NATS linked to its performance. Failure to reach target levels may incur penalties and reduce the charges paid by airlines.
When airlines are responsible for delays, they have to pay compensation to the passenger and pay for alternative flights, accommodation and food. When NATS are responsible for delays, no compensation is payable at all. Worse, when NATS are responsible for delays, the airlines have to pick up the bill, in this case £100 million, for alternative flights, food and accommodation.
As the Noble Lord Young said, more than 2,000 flights cancelled, meaning many thousands of passengers, including members of my family and I'm sure members of your Lordship's House, were left at chaotic airports with no information, help or support from airlines. It was utterly miserable, expensive and very concerning for all those affected. This has now become a routine occurrence during periods of disruption. So if lessons are going to be learned, how quickly will the investigation report, and when will airlines be held to account? Will the enforcement powers for the CAA come forward in the King's Speech?
As I have noted, and I believe as Noble Lords will be aware, the report from NATS, the preliminary report from NATS, was submitted to the CAA yesterday. It was then subsequently transmitted to the Secretary of State. It will be made public in due course.
Preliminary reports seem to indicate that a rogue flight plan out of many thousands of flight plans was fed into the system, and that seemed to cause this disruption. Can we just focus on the pride we have in our own air traffic controllers, who played no part at all in how this incident occurred?
I'd like to thank my noble friend for raising that, because I'm enormously grateful for the work of our air traffic controllers. I've visited Swanwick, I've seen them at their work firsthand. It's an enormously stressful job. And in this very rare event, I think all noble lords must agree that the system failed safely. We are in agreement that at no point was there a risk to life, and in so doing, it does show that the system is working.
And then finally, Sean, back in the Commons, the former Cabinet Minister Sir Gavin Williamson was forced to make an apology in the House of Commons. Tell us about that.
Yes, so this is a row which has its roots in the events of a year ago. Sir Gavin Williamson, a former Cabinet Minister and so a senior MP, was very annoyed that he had not been invited to attend the Queen's funeral. And he sent texts, and he had a text exchange with the then government chief whip, Wendy Morton, and these were pretty expletive-filled texts, I think we can say, and an independent panel found that Sir Gavin had bullied Wendy Morton. He'd broken the rules on bullying and harassment, and so as a result he had to come to the Commons and make an apology.
With your permission, Mr Deputy Speaker, I wish to make a personal statement regarding an exchange that occurred on September the 13th and 14th, 2022, between myself and the then Chief Whip, the Right Honourable Member for Aldridge Brownhills. During this exchange, I used intemperate and inappropriate language, which I regret and I apologised for shortly after. My behaviour led to a complaint. The complaint was initially dismissed by the Commissioner for Parliamentary Standards. However, this decision was appealed and subsequently reversed by the independent expert panel. I accept the decision that my conduct constituted a breach of the bullying and harassment policy and have since reflected on my behaviour. I reiterate my apology made to the complainant following the breach. I apologise to them again now, and I apologise to the House fully and unreservedly. I will do my utmost to ensure this does not happen again.
Well, you could see Wendy Morton was there in the Commons to hear the apology, and she said that she's relieved by the outcome. Just before we go, Sean, Parliament welcomed 3 more MPs this week, didn't it?
Yes, it used to be that by-elections, these elections that take place in between general elections, were a bit of a rarity. But now, a bit like buses, they seem to come along in threes. So as you say, we'd had these 3 elections just before the Commons started its break. So the MPs, the winners, had not been able to take their seats. So there was 1 Conservative, 1 Liberal Democrat and 1 Labour. They all took their places. And then also, at the start of this new parliamentary term, we had the confirmation of some more by-elections coming up. The SNP moved the writ for a by-election in Rutherglen and Hamilton West, and the Conservatives moved the writ for a by-election in Mid-Bedfordshire. And then, just yesterday, we heard that the former government minister, Chris Pincher, was resigning from the Commons, which means there will be a 3rd by-election in Tamworth. So we've had 3 new MPs this week, and in very short order, we will have 3 more new MPs because we'll have another clutch of 3 by-elections next month.
Something tells me we've got another busy term ahead of us in Westminster, Sean. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining us and talking us through all of that. Now, that's all Politics UK has time for this week. Joe Coburn will be back with Politics Live on Monday at 12:15 on BBC 2 and iPlayer. In the meantime, have a great weekend.